Chapter 1. The Alpha of Ironveil Keep had no idea that the feral girl who'd been stealing dried venison from his cold stores, sleeping curled in the hollow beneath his eastern watchtower, and pressing her ear to the stone each night to listen to the heartbeat of his pack had once been called the most powerful Omega bloodline in 3 territories, and that the wolves who'd destroyed her family still believed she was buried in the ash of the Ashfen pack grounds some way past the northern border. She intended to keep it that way. Nara pressed her palm flat against the rough granite wall and felt the vibration of heavy boots 2 corridors away. She'd learned Ironveil's rhythms the way a wolf learns a forest, not by memorizing it, but by becoming part of it. Every patrol rotation, every groan of the portcullis chain at the hour change, every draft that moved through the gaps between stones that only she was small and desperate enough to use. 18 months of living beneath the skin of this keep had made her into something the pack had no name for. Not a rogue. Not a spy. Not a ghost. Ghosts didn't get hungry. Something that breathed in the spaces between other people's certainties and left no scent trail worth following. Tonight, though, something was wrong. The patrol wasn't walking its usual circuit. She'd memorized the night sentinels the way a hunted thing memorizes everything, with her whole body, with the animal part of her brain that had learned long ago that forgetting even one detail got you killed. They always moved south to north along the inner wall, paused at the weapons rack, doubled back toward the great hall. Every night. Same boots. Same timing. She could have counted the steps in her sleep. But these footsteps were moving east. Slow and deliberate, with the particular patience of someone who wasn't patrolling, someone who was looking. They were heading directly toward the gap in the lower foundation wall she used every other night to slip into the cold stores. Nara held her breath. The hollow she occupied was barely wide enough for her shoulders. It had been a drainage channel once, carved into the original foundations when the keep was built 4 centuries ago, long before the newer stone swallowed the old bones and everyone stopped asking what was buried inside the walls. She'd found the entrance on her first night, half out of her mind with cold and pain, 2 ribs cracked from the fall she'd taken crossing the Ashfen border, burns she hadn't yet had the courage to examine striped across her back and climbing her jaw. She remembered crawling. She could admit that now, to the dak, where no pride survived anyway. She'd been on her hands and knees in the mud at the base of Ironveil's outer wall when the stone had simply opened for her, a gap too small for any wolf who wasn't running for their life to bother squeezing through. The keep had taken her in the way a wound takes in a splinter. Quietly. Completely. Without asking her reasons. She'd never left. Nara pressed her eye to the crack in the foundation stone and looked into the cold stores below. A man stood in the room. Not a guard. Not a kitchen worker pulling night stock. Aldric Vane. Alpha of Ironveil Keep. Barefoot on the flagstone floor, dark hair loose around his face, wearing nothing but sleep trousers and an expression of absolute, infuriating calm. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest and his grey eyes moving through the room with the slow, unhurried patience of a predator who already knew the prey was close and hadn't yet decided what to do about that. Nara's pulse hit her throat like a fist. She'd seen him before. Of course she had. Hundreds of times, through hundreds of different cracks, across 18 months of watching this man move through his own territory. She'd watched Aldric Vane settle pack disputes with a stillness that made wolves twice his size defer before they understood why. She'd watched him stand alone in the sparring yard at midnight, working the post long after every other wolf had gone to bed, not with fury, but with the focused, repetitive discipline of someone who believed in preparing for things he couldn't yet name. She'd watched him sit at the head of the war table and listen, actually listen, with his full attention, to the lowest-ranked soldier in the room before he gave a single order. She'd watched him press 2 fingers to his sternum sometimes, a quiet private gesture, there and gone, like a man holding something down that wanted to rise. She knew his face better than she knew her own. He had never once looked in her direction. Not until now. His gaze swept across the cold store and stopped. Not at the crack she was watching through. Close to it. Close enough that the cold running through her had nothing to do with the stone. "I know you're in here," he said. His voice was low. Not loud, not threatening. It moved through stone the way a wolf's howl moves through a forest at night. Not asking permission, simply present, filling every hollow space whether you invited it or not. Nara didn't move. Her fingers pressed flat against the wall. She could retreat. The channel forked 8 feet behind her. Left dropped into the old cistern passage under the armory. Right opened behind the grain storage where the stones stayed warm from the kitchen hearth above. She could disappear into the bones of this keep and not surface for days. She'd done it before. "You've been here a while." He crouched down and studied the floor with the particular, precise attention of a tracker. 2 different entry patterns in this room. One belongs to the kitchen staff. I know they wait and stride by now. The other's lighter. Careful. Always takes from the back of the stock rack, never disturbs the front. A pause that held the smallest edge of something that wasn't quite amusement, but was close to it. Whoever it is knows I count inventory from the front. They've been working around me. Silence. The dried venison started going about 6 weeks ago. Before that, smoked fish from the lower shelf. Another pause. Good choices. High caloric value, long shelf stability, minimal evidence. Whoever you are, you know what you're doing. Nara pressed her forehead against the cold stone and closed her eyes. 18 months. 18 months of silence and invisible survival and teaching herself to need nothing and no one. 18 months of watching this man's life through stone and shadow and accumulating something she hadn't asked for and couldn't name. A knowledge of him that felt almost indecent in its intimacy. She knew he was patient with the low-ranked wolves and sharp with nobles who confused rank with character. She knew he kept a 3-legged wolfhound that slept at the foot of his bed. She knew he hadn't laughed, truly laughed, with his whole face, in all the months she'd watched him. She knew he carried something alone and had never put it down. She knew she should retreat. Her hand found the edge of the stone panel and pushed. The gap opened with a scrape that echoed off the walls and made him rise from his crouch and pivot fast. Dropping into a combat stance before recognition, or something like it, pulled him slowly back to stillness. Nara stepped into the cold store. She blinked against even the thin slant of moonlight coming through the arrow slits and waited for his expression to settle. She knew, without needing a mirror, how she looked. Her clothes were cast-offs from the packed laundry discard pile. A training tunic too wide across the shoulders, leggings patched so many times they were more repair than original fabric. Her hair was dark, almost black, kept in a rough braid because loose hair snagged on stone. She was lean in the way that comes from sustained scarcity, not discipline. And she was standing in front of the alpha of Ironveil Keep, barefoot on his cold store floor, at midnight, with no plan at all for what came next. His gaze moved over her, not the way powerful men's gazes usually moved over women in compromised positions. Not calculating, not assessing for usefulness or threat. This was something else. Careful, thorough, in the way of someone who wanted to understand rather than categorize. She watched his eyes find the rope burns on her wrists from navigating tight passages. She watched them track upward and stop on the scar along her jaw. The burn scar that climbed from her collarbone up the left side of her face, old now, fully healed, but unmistakable. She watched something move through his expression that pulled his jaw tight and settled low behind his eyes. It looked, unmistakably, like anger, held on a very short leash. Not directed at her. At whatever had put the scar there. How long? He asked. 18 months. Her voice came out rough and underused. She swallowed. Give or take a few weeks. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled, slow and controlled, and lifted one hand to press his knuckles briefly to his mouth. She recognized the gesture. She'd seen it through a dozen different cracks in a dozen different walls. It meant he was thinking hard about something he hadn't anticipated. The East Foundation gap, he said. My stonemason flagged it for repair 7 months ago. I kept finding reasons to delay the order. He met her eyes. Something unreadable moved through his. I don't think that was an accident. Nara said nothing. The silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable, not quite threatening. Something else. Something with more texture than either. I'm not calling the sentinels, he said. If I wanted you caught, I would have sealed every gap in this keep and waited. I didn't. He uncrossed his arms. There's hot grain up in the whole stores. Still sealed from this morning. Come up and eat something real. Her pride formed the word no. Her body, which had been surviving on smoked venison and cold determination for the better part of 2 years, formed a different word entirely. All right, she said, and hated how small it sounded. He moved up the servant's stair with the ease of a man who had spent his entire life knowing where everything in his home was kept. He returned with a covered clay pot of grain porridge, still faintly warm, and a portion of hard cheese and preserved fruit from the quality stock she'd always been too careful to touch. He set them in front of her and lowered himself to sit on the flagstone floor across from her, without ceremony, without the performance of authority that she might have expected from an alpha eating on the floor of his own cold store at midnight. She ate. She tried to eat with dignity. She managed approximately 4 seconds of it before the warmth of the first mouthful undid something that had been clenched tight in her chest for 18 months, and she ate the way she actually was, efficiently, completely, without looking up. When she finally raised her eyes, his face held no pity. Just that steady, careful attention, and beneath it, the anger she'd clocked earlier, still quietly burning. "What do I call you?" he asked. She hesitated. Her name was a dangerous thing. Her name was threaded through a bloodline that certain wolves had paid soldiers and fire to eliminate permanently. A name that, spoken in the wrong room, would send those same wolves north to finish their work. "Nara," she said. Just that. "Nara." He said it once, quietly, as though pressing his thumb to a bruise to test whether it was real. "I'm Aldric. I imagine you already know that." Heat moved up the back of her neck. She looked at the empty pot. "You can stay," he said. She looked up sharply. "Not in the foundation gaps. I have quarters, an entire east wing that's been empty for years. Whatever you're running from, it hasn't found you in 18 months inside these walls. Ironveil has proven it can shelter you." He leaned forward slightly, forearms resting on his knees, and the thin moonlight caught the silver in his eyes and turned them into something that looked almost safe. Almost was the most dangerous word Nara knew. But you shouldn't have to live like the castle's secret in order to be safe inside it. "You don't know me." "No." Flat, without apology. "But I know what it looks like when a wolf has been running so long they've forgotten how to stop. And I know you chose my walls, out of every territory in the north." Something in his voice lowered. "I would rather give you a door than leave you surviving without one." The words landed somewhere Nara had sealed and mortared over and refused to examine for a long time. She pressed her lips together and breathed through it. "I'll think about it," she managed. "Take your time." He rose easily. "East wing, second floor, end of the corridor. The room bolts from the inside. I'll leave provisions outside the door in the morning." He turned, and then stopped, looked back at her over his shoulder, and the edge of his mouth shifted. "And Nara, if you're going to keep using the cold stores, for the love of the pack, take from the front rack. The stock in the back is endurance rations. High protein, no flavor whatsoever. You've been eating the punishment food for 6 weeks." She almost laughed. It caught in her chest and didn't quite make it out, but it was there. The almost of it was enough. He left. She sat alone in the dark cold of the foundation stones and pressed her palms flat on the floor where he'd been sitting and felt, for the first time in 18 months, the terrifying and completely unwelcome possibility that she might not have to survive this alone. She didn't take the room the next day, or the day after. She watched from the gaps as he left the provisions outside the door exactly as promised, a wrapped parcel, a covered flask of something hot. She watched him check the corridor each morning, find the untouched bundle, and walk away without comment, without hesitation, without any trace of expectation on his face. On the third night, she heard something that changed everything. Chapter 2. She was in the channel behind the East War room. It was the passage she'd used most in her first months at Ironveil. Pressed flat against the interior stone, listening to patrol briefings and territorial reports and the low, procedural business of a pack that ran itself with quiet efficiency. She'd learned the names of every sentinel captain, every border post, every disputed tree line along the northern territories. Not because she'd planned to use the information. Because information was the only currency available to a wolf living inside walls, and old habits from a life she was no longer supposed to have died hard. But tonight Aldric was alone, and he wasn't conducting pack business. He stood at the war table with his back to the room, speaking into the communication glass mounted above the map shelf, a disk of silvered obsidian that carried voice across distances when pressed with intent. His shoulders were set in a way she recognized, not the broad, settled posture he carried in front of his pack. Tighter, like a man handling something that required both hands and his full weight. "The Ashfen pack grounds," he said. 3 years ago. I want every official record, the council decree, the execution order, the territorial seizure documents. Every name attached to the authorization chain." Nara stopped breathing. Ashfen, her pack's name. Spoken in his voice, in his war room, in the middle of the night. The bloodline listed for elimination was confirmed destroyed. The voice from the glass replied. Flat, administrative. The voice of someone reading from a ledger rather than describing the end of a living family. Council records show full compliance. No survivors documented. Someone survived. Aldric's voice was low and precise and carried the particular weight of a man who had already decided what he believed and was now building the case to prove it. I want the original authorization, not the summary record. The document that carries the seal of whoever gave the order. And I want every financial transfer connected to the seizure of Ashfen territory in the 6 months before and after the cull. A pause from the glass. That's a significant request. The council archive is not above scrutiny. Quiet. Absolute. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you what I need and when I need it. He pressed 2 fingers to the glass and the connection closed. Nara's hand was shaking. She pressed it flat against the stone wall and held it there until the trembling moved from her fingers into her palm and then into the wall itself, absorbed by 4 centuries of solid granite that had no opinion about any of it. He was investigating the Ashfen cull. He was pulling at the threads of the order that had killed her mother, her father, her 2 younger brothers, and every elder of her bloodline in a single night. He was doing it alone, at midnight, in a locked room, with the focused and controlled anger of someone who had been thinking about it for a long time. Why? The question came up through her like a howl she had no room to release. She stepped out of the wall. Aldric turned fast. She'd expected that, had seen his reflexes 100 times from the other side of stone. His hand dropped to the table edge, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, and then recognition caught up with his instincts and he went still. His grey eyes moved over her face with the sharp attention of a man recalibrating quickly. Nara. She was trembling. She couldn't stop it. 18 months of careful stillness and now her whole body was coming apart at the seams over 6 words spoken into a communication glass. The Ashfen cull, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. You're investigating it. Something moved through his expression. Careful. Watching. She saw the moment he began to look at her differently, not the way he'd looked at her in the cold store, assessing her survival and her hunger. This was something else. This was a man looking at a piece of information and feeling it click into alignment with other pieces he'd already been holding. His gaze traveled, slow and deliberate, to the scar along her jaw, then to the burns she kept covered beneath her sleeves that she'd pushed up in the narrow heat of the passage. Then back to her face, and she watched the understanding move through him like a tide coming in. Your Ashfen bloodline, he said quietly. I'm the reason there is no more Ashfen bloodline. The words came out fierce and shaking and more honest than she'd intended. I'm the only one who got out. They said I didn't. They wrote it into the council records. No survivors. Full compliance. She pressed her lips together hard. They were wrong. He didn't move. He stood very still in the way she'd only seen from him in serious moments. Not frozen, but gathered, like a man making sure every part of himself was present for what came next. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful. How? The pack grounds had old cellar tunnels beneath the meeting hall. I knew about them. I used to explore them as a child. She heard her own voice as though from a distance, flat and factual, the way she'd learned to speak about it in her head so the weight of it didn't knock her flat. When they came, I was the only one close enough to the entrance. I ran. 3 days through the border territories before I crossed into the unclaimed land. Then another 4 days west. She looked at him steadily. And then I found your walls. The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture and weight and the particular quality of a silence in which someone is deciding very carefully what to do with something irreplaceable. Aldric moved toward her. Slowly, the way she'd seen him approach an injured wolf in the yard once, loose and unhurried, hands open at his sides, making himself as unthreatening as a man built the way he was built could manage. He stopped 2 feet away, close enough that she could see the pulse moving in his throat, close enough that the warmth of him reached her through the cold air of the war room, and her wolf, which had been so quiet for so long that she sometimes forgot it was still inside her, turned toward it involuntarily. I started pulling at this 3 months ago, he said. Irregularities in the territorial seizure records. Names in the authorization chain that didn't match the official account. Financial transfers to a contractor unit that was disbanded suspiciously quickly afterward. His jaw tightened. I didn't know it was your pack. I didn't know you were here. A pause, and something moved through his expression that had nothing administrative in it at all. But I'm glad you are. Why? The word tore out of her with more rawness than she'd intended. Ashfen territory is 2 regions east. It doesn't touch your borders. It doesn't affect your pack. You have nothing to gain from digging into a 3-year-old council action. She met his eyes, searching them for the angle, for the strategy, Because in her experience, powerful wolves didn't do things without reasons that served their own interests, and she needed to know what his was before she made the mistake of believing otherwise. Why do you care? He looked at her for a long moment. Because it was wrong, he said. Simple. Unqualified. The way a wolf states territory, not arguing, not explaining, simply placing a fact in the ground and standing on it. A bloodline was destroyed on a false council order, paid for by someone who wanted land and didn't mind using fire to get it. That is wrong. I have the resources and the standing to investigate it, which means I have the responsibility to. He held her gaze. That's the whole of it. There's no angle. Nara stared at him. She had spent 3 years learning not to trust simple answers. She had spent 3 years watching motives operate under the surface of stated intentions, watching wolves say one thing with their mouths and mean something else with their actions. She had survived by treating every offered hand as a potential trap until proven otherwise. But she had also spent 18 months watching this man through walls. She had watched him return land to a low-ranked family after his predecessor's unfair seizure, at cost to himself. She had watched him sit with a wounded sentinel through a full night rather than delegate the vigil. She had watched him refuse a trade agreement that would have benefited Ironveil because the terms were exploitative to the smaller pack offering it. She had watched him, alone and unobserved, be exactly the same wolf he was in public. She knew him. She knew him in a way she had no right to, through cracks and shadows and stolen observation. And standing in front of him now, close enough to feel the warmth of him, she understood that the picture she'd built piece by careful piece through stone and silence had been accurate. He was exactly who he appeared to be. The understanding settled in her chest like something heavy being set gently down. Tell me what you have so far, she said. Something shifted in his eyes. You don't have to. Tell me. She met his gaze squarely. I've been surviving on the edges of my own history for 3 years because I didn't have the resources to do anything else. You're saying you have them. She felt the decision solidify in her chest, clean and irreversible. Then tell me what you have. He studied her face for a moment longer. Then he moved to the war table and spread the documents already laid out there, carefully, deliberately, making sure she could see everything he could. No withheld pages. No strategic positioning of information. Everything visible, everything offered. She moved to stand beside him. The papers were a mess of names and dates and financial records with certain figures circled in red ink, connected by lines he'd drawn in a careful, methodical hand. She looked at them and felt the strange, disorienting sensation of seeing the wreckage of her own life laid out in documents, reduced to transaction records and authorization seals and the cold bureaucratic language of official violence. The order came from the High Council, Aldric said, tracing one line with his finger. But the originating request, the petition to classify Ashfen bloodline as a territorial threat requiring elimination, that came from a single source. He tapped a name circled in red at the top of the chain. Nara looked at it, and felt the bottom of her stomach fall away. Lord Kaidan Moors. High Seat, Northern Territorial Council. She knew that name. She'd known it her whole life. He had attended her father's autumn gathering every year for as long as she could remember, a quiet, thin-faced wolf with careful eyes and elaborate courtesy who had eaten at their table and hunted in their territory and spoken warmly of the Ashfen bloodline's strength. He petitioned for the cull himself, she said. Her voice was very steady. She was distantly impressed by that. He petitioned for it, funded the contractor unit that carried it out, and then voted on the council to approve the seizure of the territory afterward. Aldric's voice was controlled in the specific way she'd identified as his anger. Not loud, not dramatic, but dense, like stone under compression. He moved into a seat of regional authority using land that was taken by killing your family. The war room was very quiet. Nara looked at the document for a long time. Then she looked at Aldric, and something in her chest cracked open in a place she hadn't known still had the capacity to break. She had survived 3 years on the cold fuel of simply continuing to breathe, to move, to stay hidden, to stay alive. She had not allowed herself to think about justice because justice was a luxury for wolves who had allies and standing and the safety to pursue it. She had been surviving. Only surviving. And now someone was standing in front of her with all the proof laid out on a table, telling her that he intended to use it. I'll take the room, she said. Her voice came out barely above a breath. The one in the east wing. Something shifted in Aldric's eyes. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not patience, not the careful steadiness of a man managing his world. Something warmer than that. Something that looked like relief mixed with something else he wasn't naming yet. "Good," he said quietly. She moved into the East Wing room that night. The bolt worked exactly as he'd said, sliding home with a clean, solid sound she stood and listened to for a long time after she'd thrown it. The bed had proper bedding, thick and warm and smelling of cedar from the chest it had been stored in. She lay down in it and stared at the ceiling and for the first time in 3 years felt the full weight of how exhausted she was. Not just her body. Herself. The part that had been holding everything together, alone, in the dark. She cried. She hadn't meant to. But the safety was so foreign to her nervous system that it registered as grief before it registered as anything else. And she let it move through her and pressed her face into the pillow and let Ironveil hold her the way it had been holding her for 18 months. Quietly, completely, without asking her reasons. When she finally stopped, she stared at the ceiling until the grey light of very early morning began to seep under the door. She thought about Kaidan Moors. About the authorized order. About proof. She thought about Aldric's voice saying because it was wrong with the absolute simplicity of a wolf who had decided what he stood for and stopped arguing about it. She thought about the fact that for 3 years she had wanted nothing except to be safe. And that somewhere in the last few hours, without her permission, she had started to want something else. Chapter 3. She learned the East Wing the way she'd learned everything at Ironveil. Slowly. From the inside out. The room itself was simple. Stone walls. A narrow window that looked out over the inner training yard. A writing desk scarred from decades of use by someone she'd never know. It was the kind of room that had absorbed a long history of ordinary living and settled into a comfortable plainness that asked nothing of its occupant. Nara found she liked that. She had spent too long in spaces that demanded she make herself smaller. A room that simply existed around her felt like a kindness she hadn't known she needed. She didn't leave it the first day. She sat on the floor with her back against the bed. Old habit. She couldn't yet bring herself to be fully horizontal in a room with a door someone else could theoretically open, and listened to the sounds of the keep moving around her. Boots in the corridor. The distant clang of the training yard. The low bark of an alpha's command carrying up from the yard below. She catalogued the sounds the way she'd always catalogued things. Carefully, completely, building a picture of the world from its edges inward. On the second day she opened the window. Cold morning air came in carrying the smell of pine resin and frost and the faint mineral sharpness of the moors stretching out past the outer wall. She stood at the window and let it hit her face and felt something in her chest expand cautiously, like a fist slowly opening. On the third day there was a knock at her door. Not the sharp, authoritative knock of someone expecting entry. 2 quiet raps, and then silence. She stood very still for a moment, then crossed the room and put her hand on the bolt. "There's no obligation to open it." Aldric's voice, from the other side. Low and unhurried. "I wanted you to know there's a meal outside the door if you want it. That's all." She stood with her hand on the bolt for a long moment. Then she slid it back and opened the door. He was already turning to leave. She caught him mid-step, one hand braced on the corridor wall, and he paused and turned back without surprise, as though he'd learned to hold open the possibility of her. He was dressed for the day, packed business clothes, plain and well-made, with the quiet authority of a wolf who had never needed ornamentation to establish what he was. A covered tray sat on the floor outside her door. "You didn't have to bring it yourself," she said. "The East Wing staff were reassigned 2 years ago. It's not staffed." He said it matter-of-factly, without apology. "I didn't want a stranger in the corridor before you'd had time to settle." Nara looked at him. He'd thought about that. He'd thought about what it would feel like to hear unfamiliar footsteps outside a door she'd only just started sleeping behind. He'd adjusted accordingly. "Thank you," she said. The words felt strange in her mouth. Not because she was ungrateful, but because gratitude required an acknowledgement of having been considered, and being considered was something she'd stopped budgeting for. He nodded once. "I'll be in the war room this afternoon if you want to look at the documents again. No pressure either way." He held her gaze for a moment, not demanding anything, not performing patience, simply present in the specific way that she'd identified over 18 months as the thing that made him different from other powerful wolves she'd known. The door's open. He left. She ate the meal sitting in the corridor with her back against the doorframe and the tray on her knees, watching the empty hallway and listening to the keep's sounds and feeling the strange, uncomfortable process of allowing herself to occupy space in the world again. She went to the war room that afternoon. Aldric was already there, bent over the table, a fresh set of documents spread in front of him and a pot of ink at his elbow. He looked up when she came in, registered her presence without making a production of it, and shifted slightly to give her room at the table. Financial records from the Territorial Council archive, he said, by way of introduction. 3 separate payment authorizations, all routed through intermediary accounts, all timed in the 8 weeks before the cull order was filed. He pointed to 3 highlighted figures. Same source. Different names on the transfer, but the same originating deposit institution each time. Nara set her hands on the table and looked. The numbers were significant. The kind of significant that spoke not just of hiring a contractor unit, but of ensuring silence afterward, of paying the specific people whose job it was to make sure records stayed clean. He was thorough, she said. He thought he was. There was a particular quality in Aldric's voice when he spoke about Kaidan Moors. Not loud fury but something compressed, like heat trapped in closed stone. He didn't account for the contractor unit keeping its own records. Wolves who do that kind of work tend to ensure themselves. There's a ledger. He produced a document from beneath the pile. Copy of it. The original is with a source I trust outside the territory. Nara looked at the ledger copy. Names, dates, payment amounts. And at the top of the first page, in plain administrative script, the name of the contracting party. Lord Kaidan Moors. Northern Territorial Council. She had looked at his name on documents before, twice now, and each time she'd expected the sight of it to hit her like a wound reopening. Instead it did something different. It made her cold. Clear. Like water settling after long turbulence. What's the path to the High Tribunal? She asked. Aldric glanced at her. She thought she saw something shift in his expression, a small recalibration, a quiet recognition of something. The petition requires a territorial lord's seal and a minimum of 3 corroborating witness accounts. We have the financial records and the ledger copy. We need witnesses who can place the order at its source. He paused. There were survivors from the contractor unit. 3 that I've identified. 2 have already agreed to speak. He held her gaze steadily. The 3rd is you. The war room was very quiet. Nara had known this was coming. She had known it since the night she'd stepped out of the wall and heard his voice pulling at the threads of her history. She had known it when she'd looked at the documents the first time and felt something shift in her chest from surviving to something else, something with direction and edges. She had just not yet looked directly at it. They'll know I'm alive, she said. Yes. Moors will know. Yes. He didn't soften it or qualify it, and she respected him for that. Once you stand in front of the High Tribunal, your survival becomes a matter of record. Anyone looking for confirmation will have it. He held her gaze. Which is why the case needs to be airtight before we file. Moors needs to be already contained, title stripped, movement restricted, before your name surfaces publicly. He set both hands flat on the table. I won't bring you into the open until I can guarantee you're protected when I do. Nara looked at him. She thought about what it meant that he'd said I won't bring you into the open rather than you'll need to come into the open. The difference between a wolf who saw himself as standing in front of something and one who saw himself as simply directing it. She thought about 3 years of surviving alone, of being her own only guarantee. You're asking me to trust you with my life, she said. Yes. No hesitation. No performance of modesty around it. I know what I'm asking. Why should I? He was quiet for a moment. She watched him consider the question with the same seriousness he gave everything, not defensively, not reaching for easy reassurance. You shouldn't, he said finally. Not because I've asked you to. Not because I've been decent to you or given you a room or brought you a meal in a corridor. He met her eyes. You should decide based on what you know. And you know more about me than almost anyone alive. Something moved in his expression, quiet and honest. You've watched me for 18 months, Nara. You've seen me when I thought no one was looking. Whatever conclusion you've reached, that's the most accurate picture of me that exists. He paused. I'll stand behind it. The words settled in her like stones dropped into deep water. She thought about everything she'd seen through walls and cracks and the narrow spaces between stones. Every unglamorous, unperformed moment of this man's life she'd accumulated across 18 months of invisible proximity. Every decision she'd watched him make when the only witness was the stone around him. She thought about the 3-legged hound he'd had a stable hand quietly retire from duty rather than have destroyed. About the junior sentinel he'd privately corrected for a tactical error rather than disciplined publicly. About the nights she'd watched him standing at the window of the watchtower, looking out at the moors with an expression she'd once mistaken for ambition and later understood was something closer to loneliness. She thought about the fact that he'd known she was in his walls for 4 months and had done nothing except leave a door unlocked. "All right," she said. Aldric held her gaze for a moment, and she saw something move through his expression that wasn't relief exactly but was adjacent to it, warm and careful and quickly controlled. He nodded. "Then we build the case," he said. "Together." Together was another word that felt strange in her chest. Foreign in the specific way of things that used to be ordinary and had been lost long enough to feel like a different language. She sat down across the table from him and pulled the nearest document toward her. They worked until the lamps burned low, and outside the war room windows the keep settled into its nighttime sounds around them. At some point she stopped being aware of the strangeness of being in a room with another person for an extended length of time and started simply being in the room. Aldric had a way of occupying shared space that didn't press or demand. He moved through it without claiming more than he needed, spoke when he had something to say and was quiet when he didn't, and treated her questions about the documents with the same directness he gave everything else. At some point she realized she'd stopped tracking the exits. She noticed this with a small, internal shock. The first time in 3 years she'd been in an enclosed space with another person without maintaining a constant peripheral awareness of how to leave quickly. Her wolf had simply stopped cataloging, as though something in it had decided, without her input, that it already knew the answer. She didn't examine that too closely. Near midnight, Aldric set down his pen and rubbed the heels of his hands against his eyes and looked tired in the specific, unglamorous way she'd seen from him many times through walls. The way the composure slipped very slightly when he thought he was alone. She found she was glad he wasn't performing steadiness for her. She was tired of being around wolves who performed. "You should sleep," he said. Not as an order. As a statement of fact directed as much at himself as at her. "So should you." She was already gathering the documents she'd been cross-referencing into a neat stack. "I will." He looked at the stack. "You don't have to organize those." "I know." She squared the edges. "I'm doing it because I want to." She glanced up and found him watching her with an expression she didn't immediately have a category for. Not the steady assessment she'd grown used to. Something slightly less managed. "What?" "Nothing." He looked back at his own papers. The tips of his ears, she noted with distant interest, had darkened slightly. "Good night, Nara." "Good night." She walked back through the east corridor to her room and bolted the door and stood in the quiet for a moment, looking at the room that had started to collect small evidences of her presence. A book she'd found in the corridor and brought in, her spare set of clothes folded on the chair, the mug from her morning tea still on the windowsill. She thought about Aldric's expression when she'd squared the edges of his documents. That unguarded moment, small and unintentional, that she'd never seen from him through any wall. She thought about the fact that she was building a new category of observation, one that required her to be in the same room as him, visible, present, real. She was not sure yet what to do with that. She was, for the first time in a long time, interested in finding out. Outside the window, the moors stretched dark and vast under a sky thick with stars, and somewhere in the keep below her, she heard the three-legged hound's familiar shuffle along the corridor, and the low, quiet sound of Aldric's voice saying something too soft to hear. She pressed her ear against the cold stone of the wall, old habit, and smiled. Chapter 4. The nightmares came back on the 4th night. She'd half expected them. 3 years of sleeping in stone gaps and hollow foundations had given her body too many things to manage for dreaming to be a regular occurrence. Survival had a way of flattening sleep into something purely functional, a maintenance cycle rather than a place the mind went. But a real bed in a real room with a real bolt on the door apparently gave her nervous system permission to start processing the backlog. She woke at the 3rd hour with the smell of smoke in her nose that wasn't there and her heart slamming against her ribs and her hands gripping the bedding with both fists. She lay still and breathed. Counted the sounds of the keep around her, the distant creak of the watchtower in the wind, the low bell of the hour change, the three-legged hound moving somewhere below. She catalogued them the way she always catalogued things, building the present from its details, and gradually the smell of smoke faded and the room became just a room again. She didn't go back to sleep. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and sat at the window and watched the training yard below in the dark until the sky began to grey at its edges. The yard was empty except for one figure. Aldric, running the perimeter of the yard in the pre-dawn dark, steady and unhurried, alone. She watched him complete 4 circuits without varying his pace, then stop at the center of the yard, tilt his head back, and look up at the sky for a long moment. The expression on his face in the grey half-light was not one she'd seen from him before, not the controlled patience of the alpha, not the focused intensity of the investigator. Something quieter than either. Something that looked like a man simply being present in his own life for a moment before the day required something of him. She watched him press 2 fingers to his sternum. There and gone. She'd seen that gesture so many times and still didn't know its meaning. She found, sitting at her window in the pre-dawn cold, that she wanted to know. Not for survival reasons. Not for the information. Simply because it was his. And she was running out of things about him that she didn't understand. That realization sat with her for a long time after he went inside. She found him at breakfast in the small hall off the kitchen that she'd identified early on as where he ate when there was no formal packed business. A plain room with a scarred table and a window that looked out over the herb garden, where the cook left food without ceremony and withdrew. She'd watched him eat alone in that room more mornings than she could count. She stood in the doorway. He looked up from the document he was reading. Took her in, the blanket she'd forgotten she was still wearing around her shoulders, the shadows under her eyes, and said nothing except, "There's enough for 2." She sat down across from him. They ate in a silence that had, over the past several days, stopped being the silence of strangers and started being something with more ease in it. She'd noticed this shift the way she noticed most things, gradually, and then all at once. At some point Aldric had stopped being a man she was carefully assessing and started being a man she was simply with, and she wasn't sure exactly when that had happened or what to do about it. "You were up early," he said, without looking up from his document. "So were you." She reached for the bread. "You run the yard perimeter at the 3rd hour every morning." He did look up then, a brief, assessing glance. "Most mornings." "Why the 3rd hour?" A pause. He set the document down with the particular deliberateness of a man deciding to be present for a conversation rather than adjacent to it. "My father used to say that the 3rd hour is when a wolf finds out what it's actually made of. The body wants to stop. The mind tries to negotiate." Something moved in his expression. "I find it useful." "For what?" "For remembering that most things that feel impossible at the 3rd hour aren't." He held her gaze. "Did you sleep?" The directness of it, no diplomatic circling, no performance of not noticing the shadows under her eyes, caught her slightly off guard. "Not much. Nightmares." She considered denying it. The instinct was old and reflexive. Don't show the weakness, don't give anything away that could be used. She recognized it for what it was and set it aside. "Yes." He nodded, as though this was information he was simply receiving rather than reacting to. "They've been consistent since you moved into the room." "They were there before. I just didn't have enough quiet to hear them." She looked at her hands around the mug. The stone gaps don't leave much room for dreaming. Apparently a real bed does. He was quiet for a moment. She glanced up and found him looking at her with an expression that had nothing managed in it, open, direct, and carrying that particular low anger she'd identified as his response to evidence of what she'd survived. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words. No elaboration, no performance of sympathy, no pivot to what could be done about it. Just the statement, placed clean and whole in the space between them. She found it moved through her in a way that extensive expressions of concern never had. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. He picked up his document again, giving her the privacy of the shared silence, and she sat with her tea and the grey morning light and felt the strange, gradual work of being known by someone without having chosen to show them anything, of having been seen through walls, through the honest hours, and finding that what they'd seen had not made them careful around her but simply present. After a while she said, "The gesture. 2 fingers to your sternum." She watched him go very still. "I've seen you do it many times. I used to wonder what it meant." He looked at her for a long moment. She thought he might decline to answer. It was a private thing, she'd always known that, and she was asking him to hand it over voluntarily in a way that was different from anything she'd observed from him before. "My mother," he said finally. "She used to press her hand to my chest when I was young, when I was frightened or overwhelmed. She said it was to remind me that the pack lived there, that I was never carrying anything alone." He paused. "She's been gone for 9 years. His voice was entirely even. "I kept the gesture." Nara looked at him across the scarred breakfast table in the early grey light. She thought about his mother pressing her hand to a small boy's chest during a moment of fear, teaching him that he was held. She thought about Aldric performing that gesture alone, in private, for 9 years, in the absence of the person who had first given it meaning. She thought about all the weights he'd been carrying alone and the specific loneliness of a wolf who leads well and grieves quietly and keeps the private parts of his life tucked carefully out of view. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He nodded once, the way he acknowledged things that mattered without making a production of the mattering. The investigation deepened in the weeks that followed. Aldric's contact outside the territory had located a second copy of the contractor ledger and, more critically, a former council clerk willing to provide testimony, a low-ranked wolf named Suith who had processed the original authorization documents and kept, with the careful self-preservation instincts of someone who worked closely with powerful and unscrupulous wolves, copies of everything he'd been told to file and forget. They met him in the war room on a grey afternoon while rain moved across the moors and the keep settled around them with the particular contentment of stone in wet weather. Suith was a small, anxious wolf with careful eyes who looked at Nara when he came in and went very still. "Your Ashfen bloodline," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long time with an expression she recognized, the specific, uncomfortable weight of a person who has been complicit in something by proximity and has been carrying it since. "I processed the authorization documents," he said. "I knew what they were. I filed them because I was told to and because I was afraid." He swallowed. "I've been afraid of this conversation for 3 years." "Then let's have it," Nara said. "And be done with it." She hadn't expected to find the conversation steady. She'd expected it to tear something open in her, the dry procedural voice of a clerk describing the paperwork behind the night that had ended everything she'd known. But it didn't tear anything open. It did something different. It gave her back pieces of her own history, each one a weight that had been floating loose and was now being placed, named, and set down. She asked precise questions. Aldric took careful notes. Suith answered everything with the slightly shaking thoroughness of a wolf who had decided that if he was finally doing the right thing, he was going to do all of it. When it was done, when Suith had been thanked and given safe accommodation in the west quarters, Nara stood at the war room window and looked out at the rain moving across the moors and felt the strange stillness of a person who has just watched a door they thought was permanently sealed shift slightly on its hinges. "We have enough," Aldric said from behind her. "Financial records, the contractor ledger, 2 witness testimonies." A pause. "We can file for tribunal." She didn't turn around. "When?" "As soon as you're ready." His voice was careful. "Not before." She thought about that. About what ready meant for a wolf who had spent 3 years in walls preparing to survive and was now being asked to prepare for something entirely different. About what it meant to step out of the last of the shadows, not through a crack in a wall in the middle of the night, but in front of the high tribunal, with her name spoken aloud, her survival declared to the world, and every wolf who'd paid for her death given confirmation that they hadn't gotten what they'd paid for. It meant there was no more hiding. She had not been certain, until this moment, that she was done hiding. She turned and found Aldric watching her from the table with the patient attention she'd come to recognize as his specific way of giving her room. Present, steady, available, not pressing. His eyes were grey and serious and held none of the performed encouragement she might have expected. Just honesty. "What if I'm not ready?" she asked. "Then we wait." Simple. Absolute. "For how long?" "As long as it takes." He held her gaze. "There is no timeline I care about more than getting this right. Moores has been sitting in his seat for 3 years. He can sit in it a while longer." He paused, and she watched him decide to say the next thing. "I've waited before. I'm good at it." She thought about 4 months of waiting with a deliberately unsealed foundation gap and provisions left outside a door. "I know," she said. A silence settled between them, different from the earlier silences, denser, warmer, with more in it than either of them had yet found language for. She was aware of the distance between them in the way she'd been aware of it increasingly over the past weeks, as something measurable and significant, as a space she was developing opinions about. She crossed the room. He stilled when she moved toward him, subtle, the way he went still when something required his full presence. She stopped in front of him, close enough that the warmth of him reached her through the cool air of the war room, and looked up at his face. At the angles she'd memoized through stone. At the grey eyes she'd watched carry so much for so long alone. "Aldric," she said. "Yes." His voice had changed. Lower, carefully even, in the specific way of a man paying close attention to what he was doing with himself. "Tell me something you've never told anyone." He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him decide, not whether to trust her, she thought, but what shape the trust would take. I've been lonely here, he said, for a long time. This keep is full of wolves who depend on me and respect me, and I am grateful for every one of them. He held her gaze. And I have been lonely in it in a way I had decided was simply the cost of the position. A pause. Until about 18 months ago. The war room was completely still. When you knew I was in the walls, she said quietly. When I knew something was. Something moved in his eyes, careful and honest. I started looking forward to the evidence of you. The missing stock. The small signs that something alive was moving through the bones of this keep. I told myself it was a security concern. He exhaled slowly. It wasn't a security concern. Nara looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she reached up and placed her palm flat against the center of his chest, directly over his sternum. She felt him stop breathing. Felt the strong, steady pound of his heart against her hand. He went absolutely still, and she held his gaze and pressed gently, the way she imagined a hand pressed against a frightened child's chest, the way his mother had once told a small boy that he was not carrying anything alone. You're not carrying it alone. He looked down at her hand against his chest and then back up at her face, and what she saw in his expression was something she hadn't seen from him in 18 months of watching through walls. Not patience. Not the controlled steadiness of a man holding his world together. Something open. Something that had been waiting a long time for permission to exist. His hand came up slowly and covered hers. His fingers were warm and his grip was careful, and he held her hand against his chest without moving, without pressing for anything more, simply holding it there in the still air of the war room while the rain continued its long conversation with the Moors outside. I'm ready, Nara said softly. To file for tribunal. His thumb moved against the back of her hand. Once. Gentle. Then we'll file tomorrow, he said. Chapter 5. She wore her own name into the tribunal filing like armor she hadn't worn in 3 years. Aldric submitted the petition the following morning, his seal pressed into the wax at the bottom of a document that named, in clean, precise language, Lord Kaidan Moors of the Northern Territorial Council as the authorizing party behind the unlawful elimination of the Ashfen bloodline and the fraudulent seizure of its territories. The financial records were attached. Suitha's testimony was attached. The contractor ledger copy was attached. And at the bottom of the witness list, in Aldric's careful hand, a name that had not appeared in any official record for 3 years. Nara Ashfen, surviving heir, primary witness. She stood beside him when he sealed it and watched the wax set and felt the particular cold clarity of a decision that couldn't be unmade. She had spent 3 years being no one. She had spent 3 years making herself invisible, nameless, weightless. A girl-shaped gap in the world that no one was looking for because everyone believed the gap was a grave. And now her name was on a document with a high tribunal seal, and by nightfall it would be in the hands of the council registry, and by morning it would be moving through channels that would eventually reach the ears of every powerful wolf in the Northern Territories, including the ones who had paid to make sure she didn't exist. It's done, Aldric said. It's done, she agreed. He looked at her with that careful, thorough attention. How does it feel? She considered the question honestly, the way she'd learned to consider things since she'd stopped performing fine for an audience of no one in a hollow wall. Like jumping, she said, the moment after your feet leave the ground, before you know whether the fall is going to be survived. He was quiet for a moment. You've survived every fall so far. I have. She looked at the sealed document. But I've always been falling alone. He held her gaze, and she watched him decide something, and then he said, You're not falling alone this time. The words settled in her chest with the particular weight of things that are simple and true and cost the person saying them something real. She nodded. Didn't trust her voice with anything more complicated than that. The tribunal date was set for 3 weeks out. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Nara's life, stranger, in their own way, than the 3 years she'd spent surviving. Because surviving had a clear logic to it. A clear enemy. A clear task. Stay alive. Stay hidden. Stay moving. The parameters were brutal but comprehensible. This was different. This was being safe enough for the ordinary texture of life to reassert itself, and discovering that she'd forgotten what ordinary felt like. That she had to relearn it the way a wolf relearns how to walk on a healed leg, consciously at first, then with gathering confidence, then one morning without thinking about it at all. She started coming down to the main hall for meals. The first time she did it, she stood in the doorway for a full minute taking the measure of the room, pack members at the long tables, the low roar of communal eating and conversation, the specific density of a space full of wolves who all knew each other. Her first instinct was retreat. Her second instinct, which she chose, was to find a seat at the end of the nearest bench and sit down with her bowl and be unremarkably present until it stopped feeling like an act of courage. It took 4 days. Then it was simply dinner. The pack noticed her, of course. She was a stranger in an established territory, and wolves notice strangers the way they notice changes in wind direction, automatically, without deciding to. She felt the attention move over her at meals and in the corridors, curious and assessing. Aldric had told them only that she was a guest under his personal protection, and the particular way he'd said personal protection had apparently communicated something in the specific social register of pack politics that meant nobody asked questions to her face. She was grateful for that. She was also aware, in the way she was aware of most things she hadn't yet decided how to address, that the way Aldric looked at her at the dinner table had been noticed. That the fact of him leaving meals to find her when she was late arriving had been noticed. That the fact of them spending hours alone in the war room every day had been noticed. Wolves were perceptive about that particular category of thing. She was less certain than they apparently were about what it meant. The nightmares continued but changed shape. In the first weeks they had been pure memory. The fire, the running, the specific and terrible clarity of waking up to the smell of smoke and understanding all at once what was happening. Now they shifted to something less literal and more disorienting. She kept dreaming about walls. About pressing her eye to cracks and seeing the war room on the other side, and Aldric at the table, and reaching for the panel to step through and finding the gap had closed. Finding the stone sealed completely. Pressing her palms flat against it and feeling nothing on the other side. She woke from those dreams with a different kind of dread than the fire dreams. Something that felt less like remembered terror and more like anticipated loss. She was lying awake from one such dream on the 12th night before the tribunal when she heard a sound in the corridor outside her room. Not footsteps, something quieter. The particular shuffle and low click of a wolf moving carefully past a door so as not to wake the person behind it. She knew that sound. She'd catalogued it weeks ago. She got up and opened the door. Aldric stood in the corridor with the 3-legged hound at his knee. He was in sleep clothes, clearly heading to or from some nocturnal errand. And he looked at her with the mild unsurprise of a man who had stopped being surprised by the particular way their paths intersected. "You're awake," he said. "So are you." Brennan needed the yard. He indicated the hound, who regarded Nara with the placid calm of an animal that had long ago decided the world was fundamentally fine. He gets particular about hours. Nara looked down at the 3-legged hound. She'd watched him for 18 months from various wall gaps, had watched Aldric carry him up the tower stairs on nights his remaining legs tired, had watched him save the last of his dinner meat and set it on the floor when he thought no one was watching. She crouched down slowly, offering her hand at hound level. Brennan sniffed her wrist with great seriousness. Then he pushed his broad grey head against her palm with the decisive confidence of an animal making a ruling. "He likes you," Aldric said. Something in his voice was softer than usual. "He has good judgment." She scratched behind Brennan's ears and felt the animal lean into it with a sigh of profound satisfaction. "Can't sleep?" she asked, directing the question upward without looking away from the hound. "I sleep fine." A pause. "Less fine recently." She looked up at him then. He was watching her with that expression, the less managed one, the one she'd first seen in the war room when she'd squared his documents and he'd looked away quickly. The one she'd been collecting, without meaning to, the way she used to collect the sounds of the keep. "The tribunal," she said. "You're worried." "I'm prepared." He said it with the specific precision of a distinction that mattered to him. Prepared and worried aren't mutually exclusive. He looked at her steadily. "Moors has allies on the council. Not a majority, but enough to create friction. The evidence is solid, but he will challenge it and it will not be a clean morning." He paused. "I want you to know what you're walking into." "I know what I'm walking into." She stood. "I've had 3 years to think about what I'd do if I ever got the chance to walk into it." "I know." Something tightened in his jaw. "That doesn't mean I'm not." He stopped. She waited. "Worried," he finished. Quietly, as though the word cost him something to hand over directly. She understood what it meant that he'd handed it over anyway. She understood the difference between a wolf who performed equanimity and a wolf who chose honesty at the expense of it. And she had watched this man long enough to know he was the second kind and to understand what it took from him. "I'll be all right," she said. "You will." He said it with a conviction that had nothing performative in it, not reassurance, just certainty, The way he stated facts he had already fully assessed and filed. "You're the most capable wolf I've encountered in a very long time. Possibly ever." He held her gaze. He exhaled. "I want it to be over for you. I want you to be able to stop surviving and start living. I want it more than I've wanted most things in recent memory, and that makes me careful in a way I'm not always careful." The corridor was very quiet. Brennan had settled on the floor between them with the majestic indifference of an animal who had heard everything and intended to nap through the rest. Nara looked at Aldric in the low light of the corridor, at his face that she'd learned in fragments and stolen glances and now knew in full, in real light, without stone between them, and felt the pull she'd been navigating around for weeks with the careful precision of a wolf moving through a space she wasn't certain was safe. She was tired of being careful. "Aldric," she said. "Yes." "Stop managing what you're about to say." Something shifted in his expression. A slow exhale. Then, with the particular quality of a man setting something heavy down after carrying it for too long. "From the moment I found your footprint in the dust 4 months ago, I have thought about you every single day. Before I knew you. Before I knew your name or your history or what you'd survived." His voice was low and even and entirely unmanaged. "I thought about whoever was choosing to live in the bones of my keep when they had nowhere else to go, and I thought about what kind of wolf that made them, and I thought about that every day until you stepped out of my wall and showed me." He paused. "And every day since has been considerably worse, in the best possible way." The corridor was perfectly still. Nara felt something in her chest crack open with the specific sound of something that has been sealed too long meeting air. "I have watched you for 18 months, she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Through walls and cracks and gaps in the stone. I have seen you when you thought you were alone. I have seen every version of you that you carry in private." She held his gaze. "And not once, not a single time, did I see anything that made me want to look away." He looked at her with that open, unguarded expression she'd first seen in the war room and had been collecting ever since. She closed the distance between them and kissed him. His response was immediate and careful. His hands came up to hold her face with a gentleness that had nothing of restraint in it and everything of intention, as though being careful wasn't a limitation but a choice, as though she was something he'd been handed that he intended to keep. She felt his breath go uneven against her mouth and felt her own wolf finally, completely settle in a way it hadn't in 3 years, the deep, involuntary ease of a creature that has been running finding, without ceremony, the place where it stops. The kiss was soft at first, tentative. Two wolves who had spent a long time alone learning the specific grammar of not being alone anymore. Then his thumb moved against her jaw and she leaned into it and something shifted, the tentativeness replaced by something more certain, more mutual, more like recognition than discovery. When they separated, his forehead came to rest against hers. His eyes were closed. She could feel his pulse under her hands where they'd come to rest on his chest, fast, steady, real. "I've wanted to do that," he said, voice rough, "since you told me the foundation gap rent was free." She laughed. It came out clean and full and surprised her with how easy it was. How the muscles remembered after all. How the sound of her own laughter in a corridor at midnight felt less like something recovered and more like something that had simply been waiting for the right moment to come back. His eyes opened and he looked at her laughing, and his expression did the thing she loved most. The joy moving through a face built for severity, wide and unguarded and entirely, helplessly real. "The tribunal," she said, when she could speak. 12 days, he said. "And after?" He looked at her with those grey eyes she knew better than any eyes in the world, and the answer was in them before he spoke it. Warm and steady and shaped like something she'd stopped believing she was allowed to want. "After," he said, "you stop hiding and start living. And I'd very much like to be part of what that looks like." She kissed him again instead of answering. The answer was the same either way. Chapter 6. 12 days felt like a held breath. Nara had lived through 3 years of days that blurred into each other. One long sustained act of endurance with no clear end point, no horizon to walk toward, just the next hour and then the next. These 12 days were different. These had a shape, a fixed point at the end of them that she could feel approaching the way a wolf feels, whether changing, in the body first, before the mind has finished processing it. She filled them with preparation. Every morning she and Aldric were in the war room by first light, reviewing the evidence, stress-testing the testimony, mapping every counterargument Moores and his allies might raise and building responses to each one with the methodical thoroughness of wolves who understood that hope was not a strategy. Aldric had a legal mind she hadn't anticipated. Precise and lateral, capable of holding multiple interpretive threads simultaneously and tracking which ones Morse's council was most likely to pull. She had something he didn't. She had memory. She remembered everything. She remembered the faces of the wolves who had come to their pack grounds that night. She remembered the specific cadence of the orders called out in the dark. She remembered the council seal on the document that had been read aloud before the fire started, the formal declaration that made it official, that dressed the violence in bureaucratic legitimacy. She had spent 3 years trying not to remember it and discovered now, under the specific pressure of needing every detail to be accurate and accessible, that her mind had kept all of it with the fidelity of a wolf who understood even at 17 that she might need it later. Her younger self had been smarter than she'd given her credit for. She told Aldric all of it. Piece by piece, across 12 days of morning sessions in the war room, she put down everything she'd been carrying alone. The names she remembered. The timeline. The specific sequence of events from the first smell of smoke to the cellar tunnel to the border crossing, narrated with the flat, factual precision of a witness giving testimony rather than a survivor remembering catastrophe. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, without flinching. He wrote down what needed writing and set down his pen when she needed him to simply hear. He never offered condolence in the middle of testimony and never let the testimony become the only thing that happened in the room. One morning she stopped mid-sentence. The words suddenly stuck somewhere between her chest and her mouth, and he waited for a count of 10 and then pushed the tea across the table to her without comment. She drank it. She finished the sentence. "You're going to be extraordinary in front of the tribunal," he said that evening, not as encouragement but as assessment. The way he stated things he had fully evaluated and found to be true. She looked at him across the table. "I'm going to be terrified." "Yes." He held her gaze. "And extraordinary. The two aren't exclusive. In my experience, the most precise testimony comes from wolves who are afraid and choose to speak anyway. Fear sharpens. If you're performing calm, you miss things." He paused. "Don't perform calm. That's unusual advice before a tribunal. It's accurate advice." He gathered the documents they'd been reviewing into a neat stack. She'd noticed he'd started mirroring her habit of squaring the edges, and had not mentioned this, but had noted it with a private warmth she was becoming accustomed to. Morse's counsel will be performing. His witnesses will be performing. You'll be the only person in that hall saying something true, and truth has a different weight than performance. The tribunal will feel it. She looked at him. "You sound certain." "I am." No modulation. No hedge. "I have watched you speak about the worst night of your life with the accuracy and steadiness of a wolf who has decided that the truth is more important than protecting herself from it. That is not common. That is not something that can be coached or constructed." He looked at her directly. "Morse will have his lawyers. You have the actual events. In front of a fair tribunal, that wins." She was quiet for a moment. "What if the tribunal isn't fair?" she asked. A pause. She watched him consider it with his full honesty rather than his diplomatic response. "Then we make enough noise that it has to be," he said. "I have 3 allied lords prepared to observe proceedings. I have a record of every piece of evidence filed and every procedural step taken. If Morse's allies on the council attempt to corrupt the process, they will do it in front of witnesses with documentation that will outlast the attempt." His jaw tightened slightly. "I have been preparing for a compromised tribunal as thoroughly as I've been preparing for a fair one." She thought about the version of this she'd carried alone for 3 years. The fantasy of justice that had lived in the back of her survival instincts like a fire kept deliberately small so as not to burn her. The version where she had no allies, no documentation, no lord's seal on a petition, no war room and 12 mornings of preparation. The version where the truth was entirely hers to carry and she had neither the standing nor the resources to make anyone hear it. She thought about what it meant that this was different. "When this is over," she said carefully, "and whatever happens with the tribunal, my lands, if they are restored, I'll need to go back." She held his gaze. "To Ashfen. To begin the work of rebuilding. Families were displaced. The land has been mismanaged for 3 years under Morse's stewardship." She paused. "I want to be clear about that. About what after means, for me." He looked at her steadily. She'd been half afraid of his expression in this moment, half afraid to find something that looked like loss, or worse, something that looked like he'd been expecting a different after than she was describing. She'd spent enough time watching powerful wolves to know that they sometimes confused wanting someone with wanting to keep them. What she saw instead was something that looked, unmistakably, like respect. I know, he said. I've been helping you build a case to restore your title and your territory. I know what that means. He paused. Ashfen is 4 days' ride from Ironveil. She looked at him. That's not an insurmountable distance, he said, with the careful evenness of a wolf making a factual statement rather than a declaration, leaving her room to decide what to do with it. No, she said, after a moment. It's not. Something settled between them, an understanding without edges, a future with room in it that neither of them had tried to fully map yet. She found she liked that. She had spent too long in spaces with no room at all. An open horizon, even an uncertain one, felt like something she wanted to walk toward. 6 days before the tribunal, a message arrived. Aldric brought it to the war room with an expression she'd learned to read. The controlled stillness that meant he was managing a response to something he hadn't anticipated. He set the document on the table and let her read it. It was from Kaidan Moors. Not to Aldric. To her. Personal seal, her name written on the outside in a hand she recognized from 3-year-old memory. The careful, courteous script of a wolf who had eaten at her family's table and called her father friend. Nara Ashfen, I confess I am relieved to learn of your survival. A great misunderstanding has clearly occurred and I am eager to address it. I request a private meeting prior to the tribunal proceedings to ensure that all parties have an opportunity to present their perspectives without the adversarial distortions that formal proceedings impose. I believe we will find there is more common ground than current circumstances suggest. She read it twice. Then she set it down. He's afraid, she said. Yes. Aldric's voice was flat. He wants to offer me something. Settlement, probably. Private restitution to make the tribunal disappear. She looked up. He thinks I can be bought. He thinks you're alone and frightened and practical enough to take a quiet resolution over a public fight. Aldric's jaw was tight. He doesn't know what you've built here. She looked at the letter with Moore's careful, courteous handwriting and felt something move through her that was not fear and not fury but something colder and more useful than either. She thought about a wolf eating at her family's table for 20 years. She thought about her father's laugh and her brothers running in the packed grounds in autumn and the specific smell of the meeting hall in the mornings. She thought about a document read aloud in the dark with a council seal at the bottom of it. She thought about a great misunderstanding. She picked up Aldric's pen. On the back of Moore's letter, in her own hand, she wrote 4 words. I will see you in the tribunal hall. She folded it, resealed it with the plain wax of a wolf who did not yet have a seal but intended to, and handed it to Aldric. He looked at it. Then he looked at her with that expression, the open, unguarded one, and she saw in it the particular warmth of a wolf watching someone they care about be entirely, precisely themselves. I'll send it, he said. 3 days before the tribunal, she asked him to show her the great hall. She'd seen it before, of course, from above, from the narrow gallery passage she'd discovered in her 4th month at Ironveil, pressed flat against the stone, watching pack assemblies from the dark. She'd seen it full and empty and lit for ceremony and dim for ordinary business. She knew its dimensions and acoustics and the specific way the morning light came in from the high windows and moved across the floor. But she'd never stood in it. Aldric brought her down in the late afternoon when the hall was empty, the long tables pushed to the walls, the floor clear. He opened the doors and stepped aside and let her walk in ahead of him. She stood in the center of the room and looked up at the high ceiling and felt the space settle around her. It smelled of old timber and stone and centuries of communal living, the particular layered scent of a place that had held a great many lives. She turned slowly, taking it in from the inside, and felt the strange displacement of occupying a space she'd only ever known from its margins. Where will I stand? She asked. He walked to a position before the raised council dais at the far end and indicated the floor in front of it. She crossed the room and stood in the spot and turned to face the empty dais and the empty gallery above it. She thought about standing here in 3 days with her name spoken aloud, with Moors across the hall and the tribunal watching and everything she'd survived reduced to, and also elevated into, testimony, evidence, record, truth, made official. Talk to me, Aldric said from behind her. Say something, whatever comes. She understood what he was doing, filling the room with her voice before the day required her to fill it under pressure, letting her practice being present here rather than hidden above it. She thought for a moment. My father used to say that a pack is not its land or its hall or its bloodline, she said, her voice finding the room's acoustics and carrying clearly without effort. He said a pack is the specific collection of wolves who have chosen each other. that the choosing is the thing. She paused. I used to think that was sentimental. I understand now that it was the most precise thing he ever said. The hall was quiet around her words. She turned and found Aldric watching her from across the room with an expression she had stopped trying to categorize and simply allowed herself to have feelings about. He sounds like he was worth knowing, Aldric said. He was. She held his gaze. He would have liked you. He crossed the room slowly and stopped in front of her, and she looked up at his face in the late afternoon light coming through the high windows and thought about walls and cracks and gaps in stone and the long patient work of learning someone from the inside out. She thought about how far she was from the wolf who had crawled through mud to a foundation gap 3 years ago. How much further she still intended to go. His hand found hers, their fingers interlacing, his grip warm and familiar in the specific way of something that has already been established rather than something being offered for consideration. Whatever happens in 3 days, he said quietly. Whatever happens, she agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he rested his chin against her hair, and they stood in the empty hall in the late light while outside the keep the moors stretched on and on toward a horizon that had, somewhere in the past several weeks, stopped looking like something to run toward and started looking like something to simply be in. That night she slept without dreaming. Chapter 7. She dressed alone. She had wanted that, had told Aldric the night before, when he'd asked if she needed anything in the morning, that she needed the hour before the tribunal to be quiet and her own. He'd understood without asking her to explain it, which she was grateful for. They were things a wolf had to do alone before they could do them in front of anyone else, and the particular ritual of preparing herself for the most significant morning of her life was one of them. Aldric had commissioned a gown from the province's finest seamstress 3 weeks ago, when the tribunal date was confirmed. He'd asked her only one question about it. What color felt like herself? She'd thought about it for longer than the question seemed to warrant and then said dark blue, not the pale silver blue of the northern winter sky but the deep, saturated blue of the moors at dusk, the blue of something that had been through weather and kept its color anyway. He'd nodded and sent the commission without further discussion. The gown was waiting on the chair when she woke. She dressed slowly, with the deliberate attention of someone who understood that the act of dressing was also an act of deciding who she was going to be when she walked through the doors of the great hall. She laced the bodice and straightened the sleeves and looked at her hands, the rope-scarred wrists, the calluses from 18 months of navigating stone in the dark, and decided to leave them visible. She had considered covering them. She had considered the burn scar too, the one that climbed her jaw, and had considered the heavy powder the seamstress had sent along with the gown, and had set it aside untouched. She would not walk into that hall as a polished version of herself. She would walk in as herself, entirely, scars and all, the wolf who had survived the thing she was about to testify to, made visible in her own body. Let Moors look at what his order had produced. Let the tribunal see it. Let the record show not just what had been done but what it had left standing. She braided her hair back from her face and looked at her reflection in the window glass. Dark hair, dark eyes, the old scar along her jaw catching the morning light, and felt, with a clarity she hadn't expected, that she recognized herself. That after 3 years of being no one, she recognized the wolf looking back. She pressed 2 fingers to her sternum, held them there for a moment. Then she went downstairs. Aldric was waiting at the bottom of the main staircase. He was dressed formally, dark wool, the Ironveil crest at his collar, the quiet authority of a lord who wore his title without performing it. He looked up when he heard her on the stairs and she watched his expression change in the specific way she had come to love most, the way it changed when he was looking at her and forgot, briefly, to manage the looking. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You look like someone who is going to win." She almost smiled. "Is that what I look like?" "That's exactly what you look like." He offered his arm, formal and steady. "Ready?" She took it. Ready. The great hall was full. Not just with pack members. Aldric had sent word to the 3 allied lords he'd mentioned, and they were present in the gallery above, their seals displayed on the railing in plain sight as a deliberate statement that proceedings were being observed by parties with both standing and documentation. The tribunal panel occupied the raised dais. 5 wolves in council grey, neutral in their appointments, selected from territories with no documented connection to either Ironveil or Moors's holdings. And Kaidan Moors was already there. He sat on the west side of the hall with his council arranged around him and the particular stillness of a wolf who has had a great deal of practice appearing untroubled in difficult circumstances. He was older than she remembered. Thinner, something worn into the lines around his mouth that hadn't been there 3 years ago. He was watching the door when she and Aldric entered, and she felt his gaze find her from across the room with the specific weight of recognition. She held his gaze and didn't look away. She watched something move through his expression. Not guilt, exactly, not in the open way of a wolf capable of guilt. Something more calculated. A reassessment. A rapid recalibration of the situation. She had expected, she realized, to feel afraid when she saw him. What she felt instead was cold and clear and absolutely certain, in the way she had been certain of very few things in her life. She crossed the hall at Aldric's side and took her position before the dais. The tribunal convened. The first hour was procedural. Evidence submitted, chain of custody established, the formal presentation of the petition that Aldric delivered in the precise, unhurried language of a wolf who had prepared every word with a lawyer's attention and was now deploying it with a soldier's discipline. He walked the tribunal through the financial records and the authorization chain with the systematic clarity of someone dismantling a structure beam by beam, showing not just that each piece was wrong but how the pieces connected. How a payment here had produced a document they had produced an order somewhere else that had ended, inevitably, in fire and ash, and a council record that said no survivors. Moore's counsel objected 3 times in the first hour. Each objection was precise and procedurally grounded, and each one Aldric answered with the specific document that addressed it, produced from a folder that apparently contained a response to every possible counterargument his opponent might raise, organized in the order he'd predicted they would be raised. She watched Moore's counsel's expression shift, incrementally, from confidence to a more careful calibration, and felt the tribunal's attention sharpen in the particular way of wolves who are watching a very well-constructed argument and beginning to believe it. Then Sewith testified. He was frightened. She could see it in the set of his shoulders and the way he held his hands flat on the rail in front of him, pressed down as though anchoring himself. But he spoke with the specific relief of a wolf who has been carrying a thing for 3 years and is finally, irrevocably, setting it down. He spoke about the documents, about the filing, about the instruction to make certain records disappear into archive categories designed to ensure they were never found, about watching his own hands process the administrative machinery of something he'd known was wrong and doing it anyway because he'd been afraid. "I am not afraid now," he said at the end, and his voice was entirely steady. "I am afraid of what I was part of. That is a different thing." The tribunal was quiet after that. Moore's counsel cross-examined him for 40 minutes and found no significant ground. The core facts of his testimony were corroborated at every turn by the documentary record, and the one area where he was pressed, why he had kept the copies, what he had intended to do with them, he answered simply and without embellishment. "I kept them because I thought that one day someone would need to know the truth," he said. "I kept them because I couldn't make what happened right, but I could make it possible for someone else to." Then it was Nara's turn. She walked to the witness position before the dais and turned to face the room and felt, for one vertiginous moment, the full weight of the space. The gallery above, the council in their grey, Aldric at the evidence table to her left, Moore's 20 feet away to her right, and the hall around her, the hall she'd watched from a gap in the stone above, the floor she'd never stood on until 3 days ago when Aldric had brought her here in the afternoon light and asked her to fill it with her voice. She thought about his advice, don't perform calm. She breathed. Let the fear be exactly what it was, present, specific, and entirely insufficient reason not to speak. Your name and standing, the tribunal lead said. She lifted her chin. Nara Ashfen, she said. Her voice carried clean and clear to the back of the hall. Surviving heir of the Ashfen bloodline and sole remaining heir to the Ashfen Pact territories. She paused, letting it sit in the air of the room, 3 years of namelessness ending in a single sentence. Surviving heir, she said again, quietly, precisely, in the direction of Kaidan Moors. Despite considerable effort to the contrary. A sound moved through the gallery. Not loud, a sharp intake and release. The particular sound of a room registering a statement that has landed exactly where it was aimed. She testified for 2 hours. She did not perform calm. She did not flatten her voice into the procedural monotone of someone trying to appear objective. She spoke with the controlled honesty of a wolf who had decided that the truth was more important than managing anyone's comfort, including her own, and she spoke with precision because she had 18 months of stone walls and solitude and 3 years of memory to draw from, and none of it had faded. She described the evening before the fire, her father's voice at dinner, her brothers arguing over the last of the bread, the smell of pine smoke from the hearth that she had later, for years, been unable to separate from a different kind of smoke. She described waking to sound and then to understanding and then to the specific sequence of decisions that had kept her alive. The cellar, the tunnel, the border crossing, the days she didn't eat and the nights she didn't sleep, and the moment she'd reached the base of Ironveil's outer wall and found a gap in the stone and crawled through it. They read a document before they started, she said. A formal council declaration. I heard it from the cellar entrance. It bore the seal of the Northern Territorial Council. She looked directly at the tribunal lead. I know that seal. My father had correspondence with the council throughout my childhood. I know exactly what it looks like. She paused. It bore Lord Kaidan Moore's secondary seal alongside the council mark. The seal of the council member who had originated the petition. She turned and looked at Moores. He was very still. His council had their heads together, but he was not looking at them. He was looking at her with an expression that she took a moment to read. Not rage, not contempt, not the calculating reassessment she'd seen when she'd entered the hall. Something that had more collapse in it than she'd expected. You came to our table every autumn for 20 years, she said. Her voice was even. You called my father friend. You ate our food and hunted our territory and accepted our hospitality. She held his gaze. And then you signed an order and paid soldiers to burn us out of the world. And you wrote in the council record that there were no survivors. She paused. Let the silence have the weight it had earned. You were wrong. The hall was completely silent. She turned back to the tribunal. That is my testimony, she said. I am prepared to answer questions. The tribunal deliberated for less than an hour. She sat with Aldric at the evidence table and felt the waiting as a physical thing, dense and pressurized, the held breath she'd been holding since the moment she'd pressed her name onto the bottom of a witness list. He sat close enough that his arm pressed against hers, and she was grateful for the warmth of it, for the solid, unhurried steadiness of him beside her in the way that she'd discovered over the past weeks was one of the things she wanted to keep in the world. She thought about her father's voice. She thought about her brothers. She thought about the meeting hall in autumn, full and warm, with the smell of pine and the low sound of a pack that had chosen each other. She thought about how much she intended to rebuild. The tribunal returned. The lead stood and the hall went quiet in the total, weighted way of a room that has been waiting for the same thing. In the matter of the unlawful elimination order and fraudulent territorial seizure, the tribunal lead said, this panel finds the evidence presented to be conclusive and corroborated. The petition is upheld in full. A pause. Lord Kaidan Moores is stripped of his titles, his territorial holdings, and his council seat, effective immediately. He is remanded to High Council custody pending full prosecution. Another pause. The Ashfen Pact territories are restored in full to their rightful heir, Lady Nara Ashfen, with all rights and standing attendant to that title reinstated without condition. Lady Nara Ashfen. Her name, spoken by the tribunal lead in the formal register of official record, settling into the stone of the great hall and the air of the gallery and the ears of every wolf present as a fact, a permanent fact, a thing that would be written down and kept. A sound moved through the gallery, not polite acknowledgement but something genuine, the particular sound of wolves who have watched something unjust be made right and responded to it from the gut rather than the head. She sat very still and breathed. Across the hall, Moores was being brought to standing by council guards, his counsel already moving to contain the situation. She watched him stand and watched the moment his composure finally, visibly, failed. Not dramatically, not with collapse, but in the specific way of a structure that has been undermined for a long time and has finally lost the last thing holding it up. He looked, for a moment, like exactly what he was. A wolf who had done a terrible thing and had believed, for 3 years, that he'd gotten away with it. She did not feel satisfaction. She had expected to feel satisfaction. She had imagined, in the long dark years, that justice would feel like something burning and bright, a counterfire to the one that had taken everything. What she felt instead was quieter than that, something that settled rather than ignited. The specific piece of a thing finally, properly, done. She felt Aldric's hand find hers under the table. His fingers interlaced with hers, his grip firm and warm and completely certain. She held on. Afterward, the whole dissolved into the particular organized chaos of proceedings concluding. Tribunal members gathering documents, allied lords descending from the gallery, pack wolves moving through the space with the noise and energy of a verdict that had clearly been anticipated and was now being received with relief. Suith found her in the crowd and looked at her with eyes that had something bright in them, something that had been held down a long time. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you," she said back, and meant the full weight of it. She found herself moving through the hall surrounded by wolves she was still learning, faces she'd watched from above for 18 months and was now standing among, on level ground, visible, present, real. Several introduced themselves. A senior sentinel whose patrol she'd memorized found her near the door with a look that was half sheepish and half admiring. "You were in the walls," he said. "I was in the walls," she confirmed. He considered this. "I never heard you. Not once." "I know." She met his eyes. "You have excellent fundamentals. I had 2 years of desperation. It was a close thing." He laughed, startled, genuine, and she felt the small, remarkable warmth of a wolf who has just made someone laugh in a room full of people, who has just been ordinary in a room full of people, and understood that ordinary was the thing she'd been surviving toward all along. She found Aldric at the edge of the hall, standing slightly apart from the movement of the crowd in the way he did when he was letting a situation resolve around him rather than managing it. He was watching her. She felt it before she saw it, the particular quality of his attention that she'd learned through walls and had now learned in rooms and had realized, somewhere in the past weeks, she would like to keep learning in all the spaces in between. She crossed to him. He looked at her with the unguarded expression, the open one, full of joy, and something else she'd been watching accumulate in him over weeks of war room mornings and corridor conversations and shared silences. "Lady Ashfen," he said quietly. "Don't," she said, and laughed. He smiled, the full one, the rare one, the one she had watched for 18 months through stone and had finally started seeing in real light. It was better in real light. It was considerably better in real light. "How are you?" he asked. Genuinely. In the specific way of a wolf who wanted the true answer rather than the manageable one. She thought about it. She thought about her name spoken aloud in the great hall. About Moore's face in the moment his composure failed. About the tribunal lead's voice making her title official, permanent, recorded. About the strange quiet that had settled in her chest when it was over. Not the burning she'd imagined, but something deeper and more durable. A foundation, not a fire. "I feel like someone who just stopped falling," she said. He held her gaze with those gray eyes she knew better than any eyes in the world, and she saw in them the particular warmth of a wolf who understood exactly what that meant. "Good," he said. "Then let's go home." She took his arm. They walked out of the great hall together, into the corridor, into the keep that had held her in its bones for 18 months and was now, for the first time, holding her in plain sight. The stone walls rose around them, old and patient and full of cracks she knew by heart. She pressed her free hand to the wall as she passed, flat-palmed, brief, the way she'd pressed her hands to stone 1,000 times in the dark. "Thank you," she thought, to the bones of the place that had kept her alive long enough to reach this. Then she turned toward the light at the end of the corridor and kept walking. Chapter 8. 3 months later, Thorn Hollow had changed. Not in its bones. Ironveil Keep was too old and too certain of itself for that. For centuries of granite didn't shift its character for anyone, and she wouldn't have wanted it to. The walls were the same walls. The corridors ran the same directions. The east foundation gap had been, at her specific request, left unsealed. Aldric had looked at her when she'd asked and said nothing for a moment and then told the stonemason to leave it, in the particular tone that meant he understood completely and found it entirely reasonable and was not going to make a thing of it. She loved him for that. Among other things. What had changed was the warmth, the texture of ordinary days, the specific quality of a place that had been running competently and carefully and in a state of low, unnamed loneliness and had, in the space of 3 months, remembered how to be inhabited rather than simply occupied. Nara sat in the study. Their study, not his, theirs, the adjustment in her thinking so gradual and then so complete that she couldn't locate the exact moment it had happened, reviewing correspondence from the steward managing the Ashfen restoration. She had been back twice in the past 3 months, riding the 4 days east with a party of Ironveil wolves Aldric had offered without being asked, and both times she had stood on the packed grounds where the meeting hall had been and felt the specific, difficult work of loving a place that had been hurt. The land was beginning to come back. Slowly, the way all wounded things came back, not in a single season's turning but in small persistent signs that required patience to notice. The first families returning to the boundary settlements. The packed grounds, scorched earth giving way, at its edges, to the patient reclamation of grass. A young wolf from one of the displaced families who had contacted Aldric's administration office asking about the restoration process, and had been put in touch with Nara directly, and had cried when she answered her own correspondence. She was rebuilding. She had always known she would rebuild. What she hadn't known, in the long years of surviving, was that rebuilding could be done from a place of stability rather than desperation, that she could tend one home while living in another, that the work of recovering what had been lost didn't require her to give up what had been found. Her father had said that a pack was not its land but its choosing. She understood, now, that choosing could happen more than once, that the choosing was not diminished by having been chosen before, that a wolf could carry more than one home in her chest and not have either one be less real for it. She looked up from the correspondence. Across the desk, Aldric was writing something she couldn't see, bent over parchment with his pen moving in the steady, unhurried rhythm she associated with him, the way she associated the pre-dawn yard with him, and the way he pressed 2 fingers to his sternum, and the particular quality of his attention when he looked at her from across a room and forgot to manage the looking. Brennan dozed at her feet. He had transferred his primary allegiance to her with the decisive and uncomplicated certainty of a 3-legged hound who had made an assessment and acted on it, and she had accepted this development with the private, profound gratitude of a wolf who had been alone for a very long time and found the uncomplicated warmth of an animal's company to be among the more quietly healing things the world contained. "You're staring," Aldric said, without looking up. "You have something on your jaw," she said. "Ink." He touched his jaw, found it clean, looked at her with a level expression that contained, in its depths, the specific amusement of a wolf who has been with someone long enough to know when they are deflecting. "You were staring," he said again. "I was thinking." "About?" She considered the honest answer. "About the fact that I lived in your walls for 18 months and never once imagined this." She indicated the room around them, the fire, the documents, the desk they'd claimed from opposite sides and met in the middle of, the hound, the lamplight, the easy familiarity of 2 wolves who had learned each other from the inside out and had not yet found a version of each other they didn't want to keep. Any of this. He set down his pen and gave her his full attention in the way she'd learned to simply receive rather than brace for, the way of a man who looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in whatever room they were in. "What did you imagine?" he asked. "Survival," she said simply. "One more day. Then another one after that." She held his gaze. "I had very limited ambitions." "And now?" She thought about Ashfen, and the families coming back, and the pack ground's edges going green again. She thought about the tribunal and her name spoken aloud in the hall and the cold, clean certainty of 4 words written on the back of Morse's letter. She thought about a foundation gap left unsealed and provisions outside a door for 3 days and a wolf who had waited 4 months before coming to a kitchen at midnight because he understood, somehow, that some things could not be rushed. She thought about what it felt like to be safe enough to want things again. "Considerably less limited ambitions," she said. He smiled. The full one. The real one, the one she would never get tired of seeing on a face that had been built for severity and had discovered, somewhat to its own apparent surprise, that it was also built for this. She found the new passage on a Tuesday. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been carrying a stack of restoration documents from the study to the East Wing correspondence room when something caught her attention. A draft from the wall beside the old linen storage that had no business being there in still air. She'd stopped and pressed her palm flat against the stone and felt, with the specific recognition of a wolf who had spent 18 months learning the difference between solid wall and hollow, the unmistakable suggestion of space behind it. She'd set down the documents and found the panel in under a minute. The passage was narrow and old, considerably older than the ones she'd lived in, carved from a different century's stone with the irregular confidence of a builder working without a formal plan. It ran for perhaps 30 feet behind the north library wall before opening into a small chamber, no larger than a generous wardrobe, whose walls were covered entirely in a fresco. She stood in the chamber with her lamp and looked at it for a long time. A wolf in armor, rendered in paint that had faded to the colors of old earth and dried blood and winter sky. The wolf stood on the ruins of something, not triumphant exactly, not posed for victory, but simply present in the rubble, looking at a horizon that the painter had suggested with a few strokes of lighter color, toward the edge of the image, where the ruin ended and something else began. She found Aldric in the study. "I found another passage," she said. He looked up. Something in his expression that was already warm moved into warmer territory. "Of course you did." He set down his pen. Should I be concerned? No. Mostly dust and a family of mice and a fresco someone painted about 200 years ago. She paused. A wolf in armor standing in a ruined place, looking at a horizon. He was quiet for a moment. In my own walls. Your walls are full of things that have been waiting a long time to be found. She met his gaze. I should know. He stood and circled the desk and stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him in the lamplight of the study, at the face she'd learned through stone and had been learning in light for 3 months and intended to keep learning for considerably longer than that. He lifted his hand and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face with the careful, unhurried attention he gave everything that mattered to him. I used to wonder, he said quietly, why this keep never felt empty, even in the worst of the lonely years. I used to think it was the age of the place, the history in the stone, all the wolves who'd lived here before me, leaving something behind. And now, she said, her own words back at her, and she felt herself smile at the returning of them. Now I think it was you. His voice was low, breathing in the walls, making the cold stone into something it had never quite managed to be on its own. What's that? He looked at her with those grey eyes she knew better than any eyes in the world, and in them she saw everything she had watched accumulate from a distance and had since learned to simply stand inside. The steadiness, the seriousness, the joy that lived underneath the severity and came out when it was safe to, and the love, unhurried and certain, the kind that had been building since before it had a name to be called by. He kissed her, soft and slow, his hand still at her jaw, her hands finding the front of his shirt the way they always found it, with the ease of something that has been done enough times to have become its own kind of home. She felt him smile against her mouth. Home, he said. The answer to the question she'd asked. The answer to a great many questions she hadn't yet found the words for. She kissed him again. Outside the study windows the moors stretched dark and endless under a sky full of stars, and somewhere in the keep below them Brennan made his slow 3-legged way along the corridor with the dignified certainty of an animal who knows exactly where he belongs. The keep settled around them, old stone, patient and permanent, full of passages she hadn't found yet and histories she was still learning and walls that had once been her only shelter and were now something else entirely. Not a hiding place. Not a sanctuary, even. Something simpler and more durable than either. The wolf who had once breathed in the walls was breathing in the rooms now. The wolf who had survived by becoming invisible was becoming, day by day and choosing by choosing, visible. Present. Known. Home, she thought, pressing her palm against the warm stone of the wall as she always did, as she suspected she always would, old habit made new again by everything that had changed around it. The stone held her hand. The way it always had. The way it always would. She turned toward the lamplight and the fire and the wolf who had left a door unlocked and provisions on a floor and waited, without condition, for her to be ready. She had never been more ready for anything in her life.